Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody for being here. I thought maybe tonight I would do two things. Bring together two different aspects of myself, which are important to who I am, but also maybe are kind of interesting for you guys too. So the first one is the Spirituality of J.r.r. Tolkien. Now, everybody's probably familiar with him. I tend to work him into a lot of my homilies at the 9 p.m. Mass. So if you've ever heard any of those, you might know that I'm a fan. And I think his works have helped to influence my life, to give me an insight onto the meaning of life. So I'm going to work in some of that. And the other aspect is my life as a Jesuit. And I'm going to tell a little bit about my personal vocation story as a Jesuit. Something that I talk about sometimes on retreats or sometimes at the U101 class. And maybe it can be of general interest to anybody who's kind of grappling with life choices, how to make a good decision about your life. Now those two things, the Tolkien and the vocation thing, are not necessarily directly related, but in other words, I wasn't thinking about Tolkien when I decided to become a Jesuit. However, when I look back at the lessons that I've learned from Tolkien's works, I feel like they have life lessons that apply to some of my decisions and my choices in life. So, let me start off by just talking about just the Tolkien stuff. Who's a fan? Oh, good. Okay. How many of these fans have read the book and not just seen the movie? Nice. Okay, you guys, you'll know what I'm talking about. For the others, I'll try to explain some things as I go along. So, and I have a few little select quotations to read along the way. So, if you remember, already at the end of The Hobbit, you suddenly realize in the last few paragraphs that what just seemed like a good adventure story on the surface was actually something bigger, something deeper was going on. Let me read for you. Then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion, said Bilbo. Of course, said Gandalf. And why should they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, do you? Just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all. There's sort of a hint there of a hidden depth, right? Like a sense of what life is all about. How the world works. And I think that's why Tolkien's works have a sort of a ring of truth to them and kind of engage people on that level. You may or may not know that Tolkien was a Catholic. And you may or may not know, but that faith, he said, influenced The Lord of the Rings and the other things that he wrote. For example, he said, the fact that he's a Christian, and even maybe the fact that he's a Catholic Christian, can be deduced by just reading his books. Which is really interesting because, you know, they're not explicitly about Christianity at all, right? And another time he wrote, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. But when you think back to, there he is. When you think back to what he wrote about, it's not at all in a direct way about Christianity, right? He hated allegory. He hated any time where an author would impose a meaning, like a one-on-one correspondence with everything in his story. And as a result, he hated the Chronicles of Narnia. His friend C.S. Lewis wrote these, but the sort of thing where Aslan equals Jesus, and, you know, the stone table equals the cross, if you've read the Narnia books. That kind of one-on-one thing didn't appeal to him at all. Instead, he liked myth, because in myth, the themes of the story are about life, reality, and the human condition. And so what I'm going to talk to you a little bit now is about that vision that's behind the story, or beneath the story, or within the story, not on the surface of the story. Middle Earth is a pre-Christian world, as he said, and yet the Lord of the Rings reflects his Catholic faith, his Christian faith. Have you ever heard of Flannery O'Connor, a famous Catholic novelist? She wrote that a Christian novel is not a novel about Christians. It's a novel in which the truth, as Christians know it, has been used as a light to see the world by, which I think applies pretty well to the Lord of the Rings. So as I take you through just a little bit of what Tolkien was writing about, you can see these sort of religious meanings coming out. And for me, they're very important. For me, they kind of are accurate. They tell you about life, reality, the human condition, the way I believe it is. So let me give you an example. As we can start by asking, who is God for Tolkien? One critic said, and Tolkien actually quoted him and approved of this, he said, God is that one ever-present person who is never absent, yet never named in the story. So he's always there, subtly, behind it, beneath it, within it. And I think we often call this providence. So let me give you an example. One of the things is that God can work through apparent coincidences. Right? So listen to this, you might recognize this one. Gandalf talking here. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far, Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on the ring blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work beyond any design of the ring maker, Sauron, right? I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you also were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. It is not, said Frodo, though I am not sure that I understand you. Do you get that kind of passive? They call that the theological passive. You were meant to find the ring. Bilbo was meant to find the ring. You were meant to have it. Who means it? Who intends it? The implication is some other power, as Gandalf says, God. Here's another example. Elrond at the Council of Elrond, there it is, says to the gathered people, "What shall we do with the ring? That is the purpose for which you are called hither. Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from distant lands. You have come and are here met in the very nick of time, by chance, as it may seem. Yet it is not so. Believe rather that it is so ordered that we who sit here and none others must now find counsel for the peril of the world." They all showed up in the same place at the same time. And Elrond calls that chance as it may seem. So again, God is somehow working behind everything, causing his own purposes to be played out in different ways. Another thing we can ask besides God, where is God? Not just in coincidences, but also working through weak instruments, such as this guy. Here's another quote. Do you remember, this is where the movie really gets it wrong. The movie has them all shouting at each other and arguing, and then Frodo has to break in and said, "I'll take the ring." And that really, I think, ruins the impact of the scene. In the book, everyone's dead quiet. And Frodo is just sitting there with this sense of dread. And he says, and then it says here, "At last, with an effort, he spoke. And he wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. 'I will take the ring,' he said, 'though I do not know the way.'" Elrond raised his eyes and looked at him, and Frodo felt his heart pierced by that sudden keenness of his glance. "If I understand aright all that I have heard," Elrond said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and the councils of the great." So again, this happens in the Bible a lot too. Why does God choose someone who is so weak and ineffective and totally not what anyone is expecting? And yet he does. Two other weak instruments would be Merry and Pippin. Like, why are they along? What possible service do they pose? And yet, Gandalf later says, "It was not in vain that the young hobbits came with us, if only for Boromir's sake," because you remember Boromir kind of redeemed himself as he died by protecting Merry and Pippin. But that is not the only part they have to play. They were brought to Fangorn, and their coming was like the falling of small stones that starts an avalanche in the mountains. Because, of course, they roused the Ents, and the Ents began to march on Isengard. And so, once again, what seems like the weak and most improbable instruments are the ones who carry out God's will. And God can also not only use weak instruments, but also good intentions that maybe are the wrong decisions sometimes. Gandalf says to Aragorn, "Come, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, do not regret your choice in the valley of the Aemon Muil." That's when Aragorn chose to let Frodo and Sam go so that he could try to save Merry and Pippin. Gandalf says, "Don't regret your choice. You chose, amid doubts, the path that seemed right. The choice was just, and it has been rewarded. For now we have met." He and Gandalf were reunited. "For now we have met in time, who otherwise might have met too late." So once again, things keep working out, but they have to use people's free will, people's willing cooperation, even if they're weak, and even if they don't know if they're making the right decision sometimes. So, another question that Tolkien can help us answer is, what should I do? If God is like this, the way that Tolkien describes, how do we respond to that, right? What are we supposed to do? What do we do? Well, in life, Tolkien seems to say, we're not totally bound, and yet we're not totally free either. Here's a great quote which you'll probably recognize. "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." One of the best quotes. Luckily, it made it into the movie, right? What we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given us. We don't choose our circumstances. We don't choose our situation. But we do have to decide what to do with it. And that's part of our free will. And we also strive, even though we're completely insufficient to the task. We may choose to do something, but we may not have, all the wherewithal to do it. As Frodo realized, he said, "I am not made for perilous quests. I wish I had never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen?" And Gandalf says, "Such questions cannot be answered. You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, nor for power or wisdom." Gandalf's pretty hard on Frodo, isn't he? "But you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have." We don't choose ourselves. We are chosen, and we have to use what we have to work with as best as we can. We have to strive. Another good one. This is Elrond talking. "At least for a while," said Elrond, "the road must be trod, but it will be very hard, and neither strength nor wisdom will carry us far upon it. This quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. Yet such is oft the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere." Do you remember there's a quote in 1 Corinthians? God chose the weak of the world to put to shame the strong, and God chose the foolish of the world to put to shame the wise. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. You eventually persevere. You try to do what you can. Sorry, I got too many quotes here. Do you remember this one from Sam in the second movie, when he's kind of like musing on what an adventure story is all about? He says, "Adventures, as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folk seem to have just landed in them usually. Their paths were laid that way." That's a great line. "Their paths were laid that way. But I expect they had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, at least not to what the folk inside the story think is a good end." So God lays us a path. We follow as best we can without turning back, no matter what the end might look like. And here's one other. It's a Gandalf quote. "Other evils there are that may come, for Sauron himself is but a servant or an emissary. Yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." In other words, we can't completely transform the world on our own, but we can do what is within us for the time that we have. We do what we can. There's one last lesson I think we can learn from Tolkien, and it has to do with the end. Spoilers. Everybody knows this though. Frodo, the great savior, right? Did he actually succeed? No, he failed. And this is interesting. And yet he's the hero. Because he's not strong enough, he's not wise enough, he doesn't succeed, but because he was willing to sacrifice himself, as Tolkien says, well, let Tolkien say it. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point, but no further. Few others, perhaps no others of his time would have got so far. Then the other power took over. The writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself. This is Tolkien talking. That one person that we've been talking about took over. As Tolkien says in another one of his letters, by the way, if you've never read his letters, they are awesome. They are really amazing letters. They talk about all his writings, but they also talk about his faith as well. "I do not think," he says, "that Frodo had a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would be at its maximum. Impossible for anyone to resist. But he spent himself completely as an instrument of providence and produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. His humility and his sufferings were rewarded. And don't forget his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum was rewarded because Gollum, of course, is the one who steps in and becomes another instrument of providence and actually finishes the quest, even though he doesn't mean to do that? It's funny. I mean, God actually makes the ending happen in a way. There it is. Okay, enough about Tolkien. I want to try to use some of the themes I've been talking about to talk about my own Jesuit journey, my own, if you want to use the Tolkien imagery, my own quest, my own adventure story. And you'll see that some of the same things I've been talking about come up in my story too. Because for most people, God doesn't speak to us in voices and visions and thunderbolts, right? There's no burning bushes. There's no getting knocked off your horse like Paul. But instead, it's providence, as I said before, behind the story, beneath the story, within the story. And that's what I found too. Working through unlikely instruments like me, and whatever you are called to do through you as well, and through people's good intentions in order to carry out something good. And just as in Tolkien, my response to this call, it didn't come out of any kind of strength or wisdom or heroic qualities. I have some gifts, but I'm also a weak person. And I feel as if God chose me for this, but I also had to make a choice. It's weird. You're chosen and yet you have to choose. Just as Frodo was appointed and yet he had to say, I will take the ring. So I, just like Frodo, I do what I can, I do what I will, to the extent that using what I have, to whatever path is laid out for me, as it says in The Lord of the Rings. And I try to give away myself. So let me tell you kind of, that makes it sound very glorious, right? But let me tell you the actual facts. So this is how my vocation kind of came about. I'm from St. Louis, and St. Louis, as you know, is a very, very Catholic town. But when I went to college, I went away to Rolla. Everybody know what's there? There's a famous engineering school there. I thought I was going to be a chemical engineer. I went to Rolla, and Rolla's in the Ozarks, and it's a really non-Catholic environment. So for the first time in my life, all my friends that I developed there at Rolla were not Catholic. And in fact, they were kind of fundamentalists of different kinds, and they were very suspicious of Catholics and Catholicism. And you know, maybe this happens to you, but when you're hanging out in the dorms and you're with your group of friends, this looks really nice compared to my dorm actually. When you're hanging out in the dorms with your new group of college friends, you tend to kind of talk about everything and anything. You might talk long into the night about this and that and the other. And with my group of friends, eventually religion would come up every now and then. And I found out that they really didn't think very highly of Catholics. They were like, you're not going to heaven, you realize that, you know, that kind of stuff. So I found in our conversations that I came to a turning point. I had to choose. Because I had grown up Catholic, I took it for granted. It was just, you know, me. But now I had to decide, am I going to stand up for everything I've taken for granted? Am I going to identify with it? Or, like some friends I knew, am I just going to let it slide, kind of let it go, and, you know, just ignore? And well, you can probably guess, I decided to stand up for it. I decided that it was too important to me to let go of. And so I accepted what I had grown up with for my own, as an adult. I accepted my faith and decided I was going to take it seriously. So I started to read more about it, kind of to defend myself in some of these debates my friends and I were having. But I started reading more about it. I started praying more. I really discovered my religion kind of afresh. And as the months went on, these thoughts about becoming a priest started popping up in my head. But I didn't take them seriously at first, because I thought, well, you can be a good person, you can be a religious person, and you don't have to be a priest, right? We all know that. So why should I necessarily be a priest? Yeah, that's what I thought would make it go away. The problem was it wouldn't go away. It kept bothering me. It kept, that that question, that desire kept moving along really steadily. And then as I began to think about it more seriously, I realized, hey, you know what? The church means a lot to me. That's college church, by the way. The church means a lot to me. I like what it stands for. I want to be able to, I like the idea of representing it to people. And then I thought, you know what? I want to take a hand in articulating the good news to people, to help people in their prayer, maybe to minister the sacraments to people, that kind of stuff. And you know, the more I thought about it, I realized I actually have some passion for this. And I seem to have some gifts too that kind of make me think that this might actually work. And then as I began to look at my history, I saw all these little arrows in my past pointing in this direction. And it was like, whoa, I never really thought about it this way before, but all this seems to be pointing towards this, priesthood. So basically, I guess what I'm saying is, I kind of began to feel like, hey, this is what I was cut out for. This is what I was made for. And do you see, it came about not through a voice or a vision, but through a lot of like examining myself and how I was made. And my friends had a lot to do with it too, because if it weren't for them, I would never have thought about this stuff. But there is one weird twist I haven't told you about yet. I had always wanted to be a teacher. And I said, I really don't want to be a parish priest. Nothing against parish priests, but it just didn't thrill me. If only there was such a thing as a teacher/priest. If only. Well, I had never met a Jesuit before, and I had never been to a Jesuit school. I was completely untainted. And so, in my confusion, and I have to explain this, this is Rolla, this is like 1985. There was no internet, there were no cell phones, none of that. I was like totally isolated in the middle of the Ozarks, and I didn't know where to turn, and I knew nothing about Jesuits or anything. I didn't know what to do, so this is a little embarrassing, but I called my mom. I went down the hall to the payphone because that's all we had, and I called her and said, this is kind of what I'm thinking about. I know this sounds a little lame, but I said, you're in St. Louis, you probably know what I can do to find out more. She said, I'll let you know. And then she called an old priest friend of ours, and she said, hey, Steve thinks he might want to be a priest. And the priest said, oh well, have him pray about it. And that wasn't enough for my mom. She wanted like something concrete, so she said, but Father, when he comes home from college, he's even brought home a book on St. Ignatius. And she said, and the priest said, oh, St. Ignatius, that would be the Jesuits. You better call them. So my mom called the Jesuits. She said, is there someone who can meet with my son? And they said, yeah, we'll set up a Jesuit. Okay, now, the weird part is, I had never brought home a book on St. Ignatius, ever. I had no idea who St. Ignatius was. Oops. I know, cue the weird music at this point. I think my mom got confused with some other saint or some other person I might have brought home a book on. I have no idea. But that got me in touch with the Jesuits, and the rest was history. So if you ask my mother about this, she says, yeah, that was the Holy Spirit working through an apparent coincidence. And who am I to argue with my mother? I mean, it seems like it's a weird coincidence, because as soon as I got to know the Jesuits, I found out they're cool, as you guys already know. Yes, I found out I liked these guys. They were kind of like, these are typical Jesuits right here. They were, you know the Latin word humus, which means earth? They were all the hum words. They were human. They were humane. They were humble. They were humorous. I liked them, and they were very smart, and they were very religious, but they were also relatable. Like, people could talk to them easily, and I liked that. It was something I could relate to, and I thought, hey, this is great. So isn't that weird? I landed like in the lap of the Jesuits by total coincidence, and yet once I was there, I realized this is where I was intended to be. So when I filled out the application, and when I had to say, you know, why do you want to be a priest, there were a lot of things that I said, but one of the main things I said was just out of gratitude. Out of gratitude for my life, my history, my gifts, my desires, my family, my friends, my mother, the Holy Spirit, all these different things moved me to gratitude and made me want to kind of give myself back. And that was the reason I applied, and they actually accepted me. So what happened then, and the last thing I'll talk about is, that's like Frodo accepting the ring, and now I took off on the journey. I guess it's leading to Mount Doom, isn't it? Yeah. Let's not take the allegory too far, because Tolkien didn't like allegory, right? The years of my, what we call in the Jesuits, formation, training. Formation was like an adventure story, like a quest, because it had moments of great excitement and also moments of trial and difficulty as well, just like Frodo. And so I'm not going to tell you everything because that would take all night, but just to give you a sampling, formation expanded my heart. I was pretty much a head person when I joined the Jesuits. I approached the world through my head. The Jesuits helped me to open up my heart through things like working with mentally handicapped people, working in a grade school, working as a hospital chaplain. All these things kind of opened me up. Another things kind of also helped me to grow in my soul as well. I took a pilgrimage, as all Jesuit novices do. I was on a bus with a one-way ticket to a shrine in Louisiana for like a 36-hour bus ride with like $20 on me. That's the way we do pilgrimage when you're starting out as a Jesuit. And what do you learn there? Trust in God. I was terrified. I was like 19 years old. I'd only had 2 years of college, so I was still pretty young, like 19. No, maybe just 20, just turned 20. I was pretty terrified, and yet that was an amazing experience that taught me how to trust. We also did other experiences like the spiritual exercises, which is the 30-day long retreat, and stuff like that, that really opened up my soul, taught me how to pray. Another thing was I got to meet so many new kinds of people I probably would never have met if I had just stayed being a chemical engineer at Rolla. No offense to chemical engineers out there. But they sent me to Belize at one point, where I got to know a completely different country and all sorts of new people. They sent me to St. Louis U High. Any graduates of the U High? Oh, nice. Where I led the chess team. I can't even play chess, but they made me the chess coach. I led them to a state championship in 1995. Thank you, thank you. So I got to know all sorts of kids at the high school. I got to know lots of different Jesuits, and Jesuits, as you probably know, are really different. So, I mean, they're all individually very different. So I got to know all sorts of people. And then you can't forget the mental part too. The Jesuits gave me a great education, and it's a kind of education that broadened my vision, broadened my sense of purpose, studying all sorts of things from Latin and Greek. Not everyone does, but I did. Latin and Greek, poetry, opera, history, which I ended up going into, philosophy, theology, so that I could be ordained. In all these things, God was with me on this journey, behind the story, beneath the story, within the story, and stretching me constantly. That's why I put up this, stretching me constantly to help me grow. And that can be painful. Growth is painful, but I'm so glad I went through it. I probably should stop for questions. I was going to tell you one more part. Should I, Dano? Okay, one more thing, just to show you that it wasn't always rosy and easy and fun. Like after about 10 years, I had this big crisis. And I started asking myself, what am I doing? By this point, I would have been about 20 8 or so, I guess. And I think part of the journey is also, maybe this is Mount Doom, I don't know. This part of it is crisis as well. I started asking myself questions. Was I too young to know what I was doing when I became a Jesuit? Did I give up certain parts of life before I really knew what I was giving up? Was I deluding myself? I started doubting myself, my motives. I doubted whether I could have made a good decision at such a young age. And then I was sort of afflicted with the grass is always greener syndrome, right? So some of my friends were getting married, some of my friends were in relationships, they had their own apartments, and I started looking like, oh, that would be such a cool life. I started romanticizing it, even though they kept telling me, it's not always cool, it's not always a bed of roses. So this was a big crisis, and I nearly left the Jesuits at that point. I wasn't ordained a priest yet, and I almost left the Jesuits. But you know what? The Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, was really very patient with me. They gave me a timeout. They said, stop your studies, take some time to think this through, to pray about this, to make what we call a discernment. They let me go off and do whatever I wanted, and I chose to go to Fordham and study medieval history, which is something fun. So they were very good to me, and my friends were also really good to me. One friend just listened to a lot of the confusion that I had. He was a good Jesuit friend of mine, and then a good non-Jesuit friend of mine. He once told me something that really affected me. He said, "You will remain a Jesuit because you are a Jesuit." Which is like, I think he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. But it's like, he's right. That's kind of what happened. Because I didn't feel like God was giving me any clear signs. So I looked up at the cross and he just was like, like, take your pick. Go that way or go that way. It's your choice. And so I think the reason God was doing that was that he wanted me to choose. He wanted me to take a leap of faith, make an act of trust. If he had just like made it clear, that's not an act of trust. But since I was unsure, I had to take a leap, even though I felt blind. And as I looked into myself, that's a weird picture. As I looked into myself, I saw I had to be true to who I am, just like my friend said. I had to be true to who I am, the way God made me, the way God called me, the way God accompanied me through all Jesuit formation. So, you know what? That crisis was actually a key part of my life as a Jesuit, because it's like all the foundations were destroyed. The rug was pulled out from under me. And that was actually difficult, but it was very good. Because then God had to help me rebuild on firmer foundations. And then I think I was a better Jesuit and a better priest eventually, for having gone through all of that. So, I will finally stop talking. Do you guys have any questions either about the Tolkien stuff or about the vocation stuff? I can handle any one. Mr. Yuhai.
If you were to assign yourself to any race with the Tolkien, like more, what would it be? Dunedain or like a hobbit?
Gee, yes, I have to repeat all the questions here. What race would I compare myself to from Tolkien's world? According to that flyer they put out, I should be a hobbit, right? Although it kind of made me cringe seeing my face on Bilbo. What would I be? Maybe it is the Hobbit. I mean, I feel like hobbits are down to earth, they're practical, they like lore, they like, which as a historian I do too, keeping records and calendars and all that kind of esoteric stuff, but they're also basically just kind of simple people. And I don't know if I'm simple, but I kind of aspire to be, so I guess I'd say Hobbit. How about you? Dunedain, all right. The men of the West. The noble ones, the heroes. Okay, cool. Any other questions? Yeah?
So, in your
Right.
You know, it's where you talked about feeling like you've been cut out for it. Like there were all these arrows and everything. Do you see those as like contradictory?
No, that's a great question. So the question is, it's a very good question. The question is, on the one hand, someone like Frodo, or as I was comparing myself to him in my vocation story, on the one hand, we're not sufficient for the task, we're weak, we're foolish, we're an unlikely hero. And yet on the other hand, we feel we have certain gifts or talents that can help us. And that helps us feel like we're cut out for it. Does that contradict? Do they contradict each other? It's a great question. Yeah, they do kind of contradict each other, and yet they're both true at the same time. There's a good word for that, of course, paradox. I guess I would say that from my experience in life as a Jesuit that I've often been amazed at what I've been able to do that I didn't think I could do, and I attribute that to God. Like I mentioned, I was a hospital chaplain. I was the last person in the world, and I was like 20 years old, that you would ever think would be walking into hospital rooms and chit-chatting with people with terminal diseases. That's like totally beyond my comfort zone and any talent I ever thought I had. And yet it happened, and it was awesome. It was a time of grace for me. And so I think as long as you choose it, your free will cooperates, God can work through you. At the same time, there's this old saying, grace builds on nature. So God probably has used little things in me that were dormant and helped them to grow so that I could meet these challenges. Does that make sense? Okay. It's a hard question, really. Any other questions? Okay, that's it. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.